Well, it's now 2:05, so I think we can start, Melinda. The people will be joining, will continue
5 geçiyor. İsterseniz biz başlayalım. İnsanlar geldikçe katılırlar. Peki, teşekkürler. Başlıyoruz. Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz. Çok teşekkür
Media and Migration web seminar reporting the refugee crisis from the lens of foreign correspondents. It's a pleasure to have you all with us just a day after UN World Refugee Day. So it's a topic that's never far from our minds as reporters, but especially at this time of the year, coming into the summer migration period in the Mediterranean. There really couldn't be a more important time to again be raising this important issue. First of all, thank you to the Turkish National Commission for UNESCO for bringing us all together here today. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Melinda Nusufora. I'm a foreign correspondent based in Istanbul for TRT World. I'm originally from Australia. I've been in the wonderful country of Turkey for just over 3 years now. And there really is no more important place to be when you are reporting on something like the refugee crisis that the world is experiencing than somewhere like Turkey, with such a significant geopolitical location that it really does occupy in the world. We will have some really interesting and enlightening discussions coming to us from our participants. Resul Serdar Atash, who is going to be joining us shortly, senior correspondent for Al Jazeera English, based here in Turkey. The lovely Sarah Firth, Middle East correspondent and dear colleague of mine from TRT World. She is also based here in Istanbul, and we are really lucky to have with us joining from Berlin, Isio Enrich, who is a freelance journalist whose coverage of these migration issues has taken into multiple continents and multiple countries. He's seen this issue from so many points of view. So it's going to be really interesting to have your thoughts. Just one apology from our participants. Marcel Metul-Seifen, he is a filmmaker from Germany, has been unable to join us today because of a last minute personal issue that has seen a conflict in his timings, hasn't been able to join us. So he sends his apologies. And before I get into some remarks from myself, I would first of all like to hand the floor over for opening remarks to Professor Dr. Deniz Bayraktar from Kadir Has University, the executive board member for the Turkish National Commission of UNESCO. Professor Bayraktar, over to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you. I welcome you all to the Media and Migration Reporting the Refugee Crisis from the Lens of Foreign Correspondents webinar. The activities of our committee on the media and migration issue goes back to 2018, when we first organized the Media and Migration Conference at Kadir Has University with the participation of the former UNESCO Information for All Program Chair, Shafika Haddad, followed by a 5 days long conference and film festival in 2019 on migration at the 20th New Directions in Turkish Film Studies conference. Recently, in March 2021, Professor Murat Erdoğan organized the webinar on Syrian migrants in Turkey and the Turkish media. Living Together 10 Years was the title of the webinar. Today's webinar is prepared by Pınar Kandemir, Director of the Training and Research Department of TRT, and she's also our committee member. And we have with us now distinguished members of the media and academia. We thank them all for accepting our invitation and contribution to our webinar. 20th June is the UN World Refugee Day, referring to the rights and obligations of the refugees based on 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, which aim to help to protect them. They deserve, quote, a minimum, the same standards of treatment enjoyed by other foreign nationals in a given country, and in many cases, the same treatment as nationals, end of quote. World Refugee Day 2021 focuses on the power of inclusion of the refugees in health systems, schools, and sport, pointing out to the severe conditions refugees are facing under the circumstances of COVID-19, Antonio Guterres points out that, quote, "We only succeed if we stand together," end of quote. According to UNHCR, 82 million people are displaced forcibly, and 42% of these people are girls and boys under the age of 18. That means half of the forcibly displaced people belong to the young generation, whose future will determine the future of their host and destination countries. Another interesting quote from the same website is, "Every minute, 20 people leave their homes and begin the journey as refugees or asylum seekers." The journalists and filmmakers are on the road along with the refugees and migrants, in most of the cases, following their journeys, writing their stories, and furthermore, indicating the significant realities out of the captured moments, facts and statistics, not only what is inside of the frame, but what is left outside and beyond the frame. Their narratives influence the policymakers, the politicians, the natives in the transit and host countries. Indeed, this is a difficult task to reflect on the stories of these vulnerable people, especially in times of a permanent flow of news and images. And most of them belong perhaps to misinformation. Migration Global Report on Journalism's biggest test in 2015 by the International Organization for Migration discusses and criticizes media's performance on migration under 4 headlines on missed opportunities, hate speech, falling standards, and sensationalism. Another event organized by UNESCO in the Media and Migration debate, which is organized by the International Program for the Development of Migration, IPDC, Melissa Fleming, spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, points out that the terms migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees are in most cases not used in a correct way in the news by the journalists. Dr. Hourani underlines the need for training both for journalists and editors, quote, "to know how to challenge the intolerance in the political rhetoric and how to contextualize the events," end of quote. So in that sense, we are very pleased that prominent correspondents in the field will share with us their knowledge and experiences. And I invite now Melinda Nucifora, our moderator, to present our speakers. Allow me shortly to introduce her. She is TRT World Correspondent. She has widely reported from Middle Eastern war zones, migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, and produced a documentary on chemical warfare during the Syrian war. Among others, I mentioned only a few of her achievements. So thank you. I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Deniz Bayraktar, for your opening remarks. Yes, as you mentioned, I have been working covering the migration crisis since my time at TRT World, but I think perhaps it's interesting to know how I got here. With a surname like Nucifora, coming from Australia, my heritage is Sicilian. I am from a migrant family myself. My grandparents migrated to Australia during a large influx of Italian and Sicilian migrants in the late 40s and 50s. And it was a time in Australia when there was such a focus on assimilation. There was no Sicilian spoken in the home, only when my parents and my grandparents didn't want us to understand something. It wasn't encouraged. Our Sicilian culture was very prominent with regards to big, crazy, noisy Sunday lunches, but language and a lot of those really important sort of cultural connections were lost because there was such a focus in Australia on migrants assimilating. So there was a lot of heritage that was lost. And then as the years went by, growing up in Australia, such an isolated island, I really did see that migrants, refugees, asylum seekers were really demonized in the media. There was very much a negative veil on a lot of the reporting from mainstream media about these issues. In the 70s, Australia experienced a large wave of asylum seekers trying to reach Australia by boat from Vietnam. And in the years since, there has been waves of migration from places like Laos, like Afghanistan, and some African nations as well. But it's very rare for a lot of these stories to be portrayed with a real sense of positivity. There is a lot of negative media sentiment out there. And it just struck me that Australia is not looking at these international issues with a broad focus. The media in Australia tends to be very isolated, very insular, very internal looking. And I realized that if I wanted my career to be any different, and I actually wanted to get a real sense of why people are making these sorts of journeys, I would have to myself make a journey and leave Australia and try and do reporting in other parts of the world, because there hasn't been the opportunity to cover these sorts of issues in my own home country. And that is what led me to Turkey. And it has been an eye-opening experience, from reporting across the border in Syria to spending a lot of time on the islands such as Lesbos and Chios. You really do get the sense that this is not just a story of numbers. It's not just the number of people who are trying to reach Lampedusa from Libya. It's not the number of people that Frontex has been able to turn away, or the number of people who are now have reached Turkey. They're individuals. These are actual real people, people that I met who still keep the house keys to their home in Syria or in Libya in their pocket, even though they have no chance of going back to that home, because 9 out of 10 times that home isn't standing anymore. But they can't bring themselves to throw those house keys away, and they carried it with them on the boat all the way over to wherever their final destination was. And it's those sorts of stories that I have felt really really honoured, really appreciative to be able to cover for TRT World, and hopefully bring to light back to some of my colleagues and at least family and friends in Australia, to give them a different perspective. And it is certainly a media perspective that they do not get from local media at home. So it's a real personal experience of mine to show how important international reporting can be when it comes to issues like this, because not every country has as broad a mind on these issues as, say, Turkey does. So with that in mind, I am very grateful to be your moderator here today. But enough about me. We have some really interesting, fascinating, experienced foreign correspondents with us who have such amazing stories to tell. Perhaps I should hand the floor over to my colleague first, Sarah Firth, who is our Middle East correspondent for TRT World. I feel as if she has probably spent more time in Syria than she does in Turkey, even though it's where she lives. I think Syria probably feels like a second home for Sarah, and she has such a wonderful connection with the people there because she has covered it so broadly. So Sarah, allow me to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Well, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. Yes, I'll start with Syria, because when it comes to the issue of refugees, that's certainly where most of my experience reporting has been focused. And from the beginning of the uprising in Syria, I was following the story. I was in the very early days, around 2013, 2014, actually on the ground in Syria, and saw what people were facing. And then having followed that story with people fleeing to countries like Lebanon and like Turkey, I think what's really struck me is the sheer scale of the crisis when it comes to what's facing Syrian refugees. Right now, currently, UNHCR says there's 6.6 million Syrian refugees, 3.7 million of those are in Turkey. And as far back as 2014, I was going into refugee camps in Lebanon and in Turkey and meeting these people, and with no idea from both the Syrian refugees I was meeting and myself, and most of the media at the time, that, you know, a decade on, we would still be covering that crisis. And it is an important crisis. What I found in my reporting is that what often happens with the stories surrounding refugees, especially when it comes to Syria, is there'll be these sort of flashpoint moments where the media pays attention and suddenly it's on all the front pages and in the news. But very quickly that tends to fade away, and it's quite easy to forget that those are just moments in time, and sometimes, yes, the more dramatic, intense moments, but the reality facing those Syrian refugees is one that they face every single day. The story doesn't go away when the cameras and the headlines go away. And so one of the challenges as a correspondent covering the story has really been to focus on how we keep the story in the news, how we keep people's focus on the problems that are faced. And also, I think as time has progressed when it's come to Syria, rather than simply continuing to report the huge number of problems that refugees are facing, broadening that reporting to look at how refugees are contributing to their host communities, some of the more positive stories that come out of that as well, which by no means ignores the ongoing crisis, but is important to highlight the contribution that refugees can give to their host communities. And also, I think really critically is focusing on solutions-based journalism as well, and holding organizations and countries accountable, because here we are in 2021 and yesterday was World Refugee Day, and you see all the countries sort of paying lip service to the scale of the crisis when it comes to countries like Syria. And yet, for many EU countries who, you know, sort of very vocal about upholding human rights and dignity for refugees, are simply falling incredibly short. You had Turkey's president yesterday talking again about the lack of burden sharing from a large part of the Western world and EU countries that can afford to be doing more. And I can tell you from all my time on the ground in Turkey and Lebanon, you have countries like the UK, for example, that contribute a large amount financially, and they always point that out when you question the authorities in the UK. But when it comes to actually sharing the burden, they are woefully underperforming. They're not meeting commitments that they've pledged to the likes of the UN in terms of taking Syrian refugees into their countries. And what that means is that you've got countries like Turkey and like Lebanon, both of which right now are facing their own immense difficulties. If you look at Lebanon with the economic crisis, Turkey also having economic difficulties, then you have the COVID-19 pandemic thrown into the mix. And I think it becomes pretty unsustainable for these countries to simply keep taking that burden. And then to sort of pivot to some more recent reporting I've done, we were doing an investigation into refugees that were crossing the Aegean Sea and then were being subjected to pushbacks by the Greek authorities and by Frontex, the EU border force. And, you know, we saw firsthand, this was in December of last year, we were out on the boats with the Turkish Coast Guard. You know, we saw firsthand what these people were going through. We were coming upon boats in the night with women with little babies. Some of those boats, you know, an hour or so out from sinking completely and those people drowning. People were shaking, they were crying, they were incredibly scared, incredibly traumatized. And it really brought home, you know, the sort of, as the crisis continues to get bigger, you see the burden in host countries like Turkey and Lebanon reaching breaking point, and you then have refugees looking to continue their journey and go elsewhere. And as a result of that, you've had a lot of countries actually strengthen their stance on refugees, both rhetorically, but also in the measures that they're taking to try and dissuade refugees from coming to their countries. And that is incredibly worrying. And it's difficult to know exactly how we tackle that problem, but certainly our focus has been on sort of shining a light on some of these issues that have been happening and some of these actions that have been taken against refugees.
I'm really glad you brought up your experience with the pushbacks and Frontex, Sarah, because that is something that has been in the news recently. Earlier in June, an open letter was sent from activists, the captains of rescue ships, human rights organisations, calling for Frontex to be dismantled, defunded, and accusing them of illegal and inhumane practices. How do you juggle that in your reporting? I mean, obviously, you know, Frontex is out there doing its own job as well, but you see the personal and the human toll that is taking on the refugees that you're following. So how do you juggle kind of, you know, balancing both sides of that?
I mean, that's a really good question. And it is important, of course, with these stories to take on board the impact that refugees have on the host country and the struggles that host communities are facing. And also, you know, the very real rights that countries have when it comes to protecting their borders, and those are understandable. I think what I try and focus on in my reporting is just always the humanity of the story. So, you know, the figures are very stark and harrowing and huge. And you know, when you're talking millions, it's very difficult to really get a grasp or an understanding of what exactly that means. But when you spend time with someone who's been forced from their home with their children, who had a perfectly decent life before war broke out, and they were no longer safe in their home, they were facing, you know, daily bombardment from bombs and fighting on their doorstep. And when you get to understand their story and then look at what they've gone through in their journeys to try and seek safety, you know, then it becomes very real, and it's very hard then to justify or to understand how people who've already been through so much would then face the abuse that they face at the hands of border security and as we've been reporting, you know, illegal actions where you've got countries and agencies like Frontex. You know, we found ourselves in our reporting, you know, there was hard evidence of those pushbacks taking place. And it's sort of incomprehensible that's being allowed to continue. I mean, it's continuing right now. So when we reported the story in 2020, there were nearly 19,000 people who tried to cross the Aegean. And of those, Turkey told us that roughly half, it was more than 9,000, were pushed back. So, you know, they set off and they've been met either by Frontex boats or by Greek boats and being forcibly turned around in some instances, which obviously is a threat to their life and is deeply concerning. And it's continuing. You know, you put the accusations and the evidence that we've gathered to Frontex, and yet there isn't really much. You know, there are some steps now being taken, and hopefully they will be held accountable, and it will stop practices like we've seen with the pushbacks. But I think, you know, we're not there yet. So it's so important that reporting continues, and that we keep putting faces and names to those numbers, that we keep reminding people of the human element behind the story, that these are real people with you know, huge amounts of trauma in the situations they faced and what they're going through, and they deserve respect and humanity, and they're not getting that in many instances.
The reporting you did on Frontex was really interesting, and I think it's definitely given a different side to that story that I think a lot of people didn't realize. So thank you very much. I'm pretty sure that story was on your Twitter account. If it's still accessible, maybe you can retweet it or pin it to the top so some of our audience members and participants can have another look at that report. It was very interesting. So you can check out Sarah's story on her Twitter. Thank you, Sarah, for your contribution. I see that Resul Serdar Atash has been able to join us. He is standing by, I'm sure, with some really great insights. So what I'm going to do is I'll hand over now to Al Jazeera's senior correspondent based here in Turkey, Resul Serdar Atash. Welcome, and over to you.
Good to be with you guys. So if it's all right, I would like to continue with Turkish. Maybe it could be a little bit different voice. So I was just, by the way, I was just recently in Karabakh, and I have witnessed the refugees there that have been refugees, people that have been refugees over the last 3 decades and so on, and all of their dramas and so on within their own countries. And just before that, you know, the Syrian issue was there, and millions of the Syrian refugees also coming to Turkey. So I have intensively covered their stories as well. What I can see, one of the first and common problem is to call people refugees. So Turkish please, I'm just going to continue in Turkish. Biz bu insanları temelde mülteci olarak çağırdığımız andan itibaren aslında bir sınıf yaratmış oluyoruz ve kendimizden uzaklaştırmış oluyoruz. Aynı zamanda onları yabancılaştırarak ayrı bir yerde konumlamış oluyoruz. Dolayısıyla pratik olmak bakımından bir ismin, yani mülteci olarak çağırmanın, iltica etmiş olarak çağırmanın belki bazı pratik nedenleri vardır ve pratikte belli oranlarda işi kolaylaştırıyor olabilir. Fakat öte taraftan bunun yarattığı temel komplikasyon bu insanları bir tanımlamaya uğratıp kendimizden uzaklaştırdığımız, ayrı bir kategori içerisinde bir başka yere pozisyonladığımız. Dolayısıyla da bu saatten sonra, yani mülteci olarak adlandırıldıktan sonra aslında normalde mülteci olmayan insanlarla onlar arasında görünmez bir hiyerarşi kurduğumuzun farkında olmamız gerekiyor. Ve insanlar maalesef mültecilerle ilişkilendiklerinde karşılarında kendileriyle müsavi, eşit, aynı hissiyatları, düşünceleri paylaşan, aynı hikayelere sahip olan, dramları, trajedileri olan, mutlulukları, sevinçleri olan gerçek, canlı insandan ziyade mülteci kategorisi içerisinde buraya bakıyor ve bu bir zihinsel hiyerarşi yaratıyor. Bu nedenle bu zihinsel hiyerarşi hem mülteci olmayan açısından bir yabancılaştırmayı getiriyor hem de mülteci açısından bir yabancılaşma getiriyor. Mülteci olmayan açısından getirdiği yabancılaşma muazzam bir hiyerarşi lensiyle olaya sürekli bakıyor olması. Dolayısıyla kimi zaman da bunun sahte acıma versiyonuyla, şekliyle kendisini ortaya vuruyor olması. Mülteci artık ilişkilendiği bir insan değil, yardım edilmesi gereken bir varlığa dönüştüğü için insan unsuru oradan kayboluyor. Mülteci açısından ise temel sıkıntısı şu, dışarıdaki dünya ile ilişki kurduğu zaman diğer bütün kimliklerinden vazgeçiyor, diğer bütün kimliklerinden soyutlanıyor ve dış dünyayla, başkalarıyla ilişkilenirken sadece mültecilik ilişkisi üzerinden ilişkileniyor. Dolayısıyla o da alttan yukarıya bakan bir hiyerarşiye mahkum ediliyor ve sürekli olarak bunun farkında. Bu mülteciliğin kendisinin bir ana kimlik haline geliyor olması hem mülteciyle ilişkilenen açısından bir yabancılaşma getiriyor hem de mültecinin kendisinin başkalarıyla, başka dünyalarla ilişkilenirken komplikasyonlarına neden oluyor. Dolayısıyla burada pratik nedenler, gerekçeler açısından bir isim gerekli oluyor olabilir, işimizi kolaylaştırıyor olabilir, devletlerin işini kolaylaştırıyor olabilir, enstitülerin işini kolaylaştırıyor olabilir, NGO'ların işini, gazetecilerin işini kolaylaştırıyor olabilir. Ama özellikle bunları sürekli cover etmek zorunda olan biz gazetecilerin bu insanlarla ilişkilenirken sürekli bir biçimde kendimizi hatırlatmada bulunmamız, sürekli bir biçimde telkinde bulunmamız lazım. Mülteci olarak çağırdığımız bu insanlar yabancı unsurlar, yani alien bir unsur değil. Bunlar da aynen bizler gibi mutlulukları, sevinçleri, üzüntüleri olan, yani göğüslerinde bir kalp taşıyan, bizler gibi hislenen, bizler gibi ihtiyaçları olan, bizler gibi rüyaları olan, her diğerleri gibi aynı zamanda hayalleri olan insanlar, korkuları, kaygıları olan insanlar. Biz temelde mülteci adı altına hapsedilmiş, yabancılaştırılmış bir unsurla değil, insanla karşı karşıyayız ve onunla ilişkileniyoruz. Birincisi bu mesele. Yani mülteci olarak bunlar tanımlandığı andan itibaren aynı zamanda bir yabancılaşma ve bir problemin kaynağı başlamış oluyor. Mülteci olarak pozisyonladığınız andan itibaren gerisi ancak entegrasyon politikalarına kalmış oluyor. Gerisi ancak rehabilitasyon politikalarına kalmış oluyor ve bir taraftan bir taraf sürekli onları entegre edilmesi, rehabilite edilmesi, idare edilmesi gereken bir yabancı unsur olarak görürken mülteci de kendisini sürekli bir kapıda bekleme halinde olan, sürekli yardıma muhtaç, sürekli hayatı adeta askıya alınmış, rölantiye alınmış, hayalleri, rüyaları ertelenmiş bir varlık olarak bir ara fetret dönemine kendisini hapsediyor. Buranın yarattığı başlı başına bir düşünsel, zihinsel dramdır. İkinci mesele, gazeteciler açısından temel sıkıntılardan bir tanesi. Maalesef bununla karşılaştığım için, yani Suriye krizi 2010 yılının sonunda başladı ve 2011'in Mart'ında da bir silahlı çatışmaya dönüştü. Ve özellikle 2012'den itibaren de yoğun bir biçimde mülteci üretmeye başladı bu kriz. Türkiye'ye, Lübnan'a, işte hatta belli oranlarda diğer ülkelere, Ürdün'e, Kuzey Irak'a, hatta Mısır'a kadar, sonra bir kısmı daha sonrasında 2015 itibariyle Avrupa'ya geçmeye çalıştı. Burada gazeteciler için temel bir mesele ortaya çıktı. Suriye veya Irak veya mülteci akını oluşturan herhangi bir ülke için söylüyorum. Nihayetinde bu insanların çoğu farklı backgroundlardan geliyor. Farklı etnik yapılardan, farklı mezhepsel yapılardan geliyorlar. Maalesef gazetecilerin veya medyanın aşırı ideolojikleşmesi burada bir başka komplikasyon yarattı. Ben bunu gördüğüm için, tanık olduğum için bunu da anlatmak zorundayız. Gazeteciliğe yönelik bir eleştiridir de aynı zamanda bu söylediğim şey. Ben gazetecilerin mesela bir kısmının Suriyeli Sünni mültecilere karşı çok mesafeli olduğunu ve hatta onların dramlarına, hikayelerine karşı alakasız olduklarını yoğun biçimde görmediklerini gördüm. Veya bir kısım gazetecilerin veya medyanın örneğin Kürt mültecilere yönelik çok kayıtsız olduğunu, alakasız olduğunu, hatta bilerek görmediğini, haberlerini yapmadığını, cover etmediklerini gördüm. Bir kısmının örneğin Yezidi mültecilere karşı çok kayıtsız olduğunu gördüm. Haberini yapmadıklarını, bilinçli bir biçimde başkalarının haberlerine yoğunluk gösterirken buraları ignore ettiğini gördüm. Ya da bir kısmının Şiilerin mesela mülteci olarak özellikle içeride, yani internally displaced people'lar açısından, IDP açısından mesela Şiilerin haberlerine yoğunlaştıklarını ama Sünnilerin dramlarını mesela görmediğini gördüm. Veya işte bir Sünni gazetecinin Şiilerin dramına bigane kaldığını, kayıtsız kaldığını gördüm. Bir Kürt gazetecinin Sünni Arap'ın dramına, Sünni Arap mültecinin dramına kayıtsız kaldığını gördüm. Ya da Sünni Arap bir gazetecinin Kürtlerin dramına, Yezidilerin dramına, Şiilerin dramına kayıtsız kaldığını, bigane kaldığını gördüm. Burada biz gazeteciler şayet böyle bir tavır içerisinde olursak en temelde mesleğimizin ana prensibine ihanet etmiş oluyoruz. Çünkü özellikle de buraların biraz da kadim bir söyleyişi olarak mazlumun dini sorulmaz. Bizler bir dramın haberini yaparken, yani bir yerde mağduriyete uğramış aktörlerin, insanların haberlerini yaparken ideolojik lenslerden tamamen vazgeçmek zorundayız. Bunların gelmiş oldukları dini ve etnik kökenlerden tamamen bağımsız bir biçimde biz bu dramın kendisini cover etmeli ve dünya kamuoyuna taşımak zorundayız. Bu yüzden ben maalesef son yıllarda bir trend olarak gazetecilerin giderek ideolojikleştiklerini, haber merkezlerinin giderek ideolojikleştiklerini, sekteryen hale geldiklerini, adeta kendi kurbanları, kendi kahramanlarının olduğunu ama başkalarının kurbanlıklarına bigane kaldıklarını görüyorum. Bunun da temel nedeni ideolojik lenslerin artık ana belirleyici etken olmasından kaynaklanıyor. Bu yüzden biz aynı zamanda gazeteci olarak belli bir eleştiri kültürünü yeniden haber merkezinde başlatıp bu konuları çok ciddi gözden geçirmemiz gerekiyor. Belki de gazeteciler, Sünni bir gazeteci Şiilerin dramına bigane kalmazsa, Şii bir gazeteci Sünnilerin dramına kayıtsız kalmazsa, Kürt bir gazeteci Arap mültecilerin dramına kayıtsız kalmazsa, bir Arap gazeteci Ezidilerin dramına kayıtsız kalmazsa, hep beraber ister Sünni, ister Şii, ister Kürt olsun, ister Nusayr olsun, hangi etnik, dini yapıdan gelirse gelsin, hangi sosyal background'dan gelirse gelsin, mağdur olmuş insanın hikayesini yapma derdine düşer. Ve aynı zamanda bütün ideolojik, politik kaygıların üstüne eğer gazeteciler çıkabilseydi veya çıkabilirlerse belki de bu durum oluşmayacak zaten. Dolayısıyla gazetecinin bu yönüyle bir hikayeyi görüp aşırı ilgi gösterip diğer hikayeyi göz ardı etmesi belki de bu zulmün sürekliliğine katkı sağlayan, bu zulmün devamlılığına su taşıyan bir unsur haline geliyor. Bu nedenle gazetecilerin bu haberleri yaparken ideolojik tercihlerden vazgeçmeleri gerekiyor. Bu mesleğimizin kamu yararına yapılan bir iş olduğu gerçeğiyle de örtüşmüş olur o zaman. Aksi takdirde bizler de bu mülteci oluşturma prosesinin bir parçası haline geliriz. O yüzden gazetecilerin ideolojik lenslerle değil, gerçekten de gazeteciliğin ana prensipleriyle, ilkeleriyle bu mesleğe yaklaşmaları lazım ve nerede bir mağduriyet haberi görürlerse görsünler, ideolojilerinden, dini backgroundlardan, sosyal backgroundlarından, etnik backgroundlarından bağımsız bir biçimde bunu sürekli bir biçimde toplumun ve uluslararası toplumun gündemine getirmeleri gerekiyor. Bunun bir üçüncü aşaması özellikle de sıkıntılı olduğunu düşünüyorum. Biz gazetecilerin aynı zamanda en az mülteci haberini yapmak kadar mülteci hukukuyla ilgili eksikler konusunda da haber yapmamız gerekiyor. Bakın mülteciler nihayetinde büyük travmalara uğramış kesimler. Ve bu büyük travmalara uğramış kesimler sığındıkları ülkelerde zaten yeteri kadar sesle sahip değiller. Yeteri kadar kendilerini ifade edecek güç ve imkanlara sahip değiller. Sesleri kısılmış bir kitle. Seslerini duyurmakta sıkıntı yaşayan bir kitle. Az önce birinci etkenden bahsettiğim gibi zaten mülteci olarak çağrıldıkları için alttan yukarıya doğru işleyen bir hiyerarşik düzenin zaten mağdurları haline geliyorlar. Bir türlü kendileri olarak var olamıyorlar. İsmi Ayşe olur, Zeynep olur, Michael olur, George olur, her ne olursa olsun olamıyorlar. Kendileri olamıyorlar. Sürekli ismi mülteci. Mülteci olduğu için zaten tonlarca constraint onunla beraber geliyor. Ama öte taraftan mültecilerle ilgili bir hukuki düzenlemenin kendisi hala tam olarak oturabilmiş değil. Yani mülteci haklarıyla ilgili oluşturulmuş bir konsensüs konusunda henüz eksikler çok büyük oranda var. Veya mülteci hukuku mültecilerin sığındığı ülkelerde uygulanmadığı zaman bu ülkelere yaptırım uygulayacak uluslararası mekanizmalar yok. Dolayısıyla artık mültecilerle ilgili tavrın ne olacağına host olan ülke, yani ev sahibi olan ülkenin tamamen insafına kalıyor mülteciler. Örneğin Türkiye'nin bir yerinde çok iyi muamele görebiliyorken bir başka yerde kötü muamele görebiliyor. Ya da Lübnan'da kötü muamele görebiliyor. Ya da Ürdün'de, ya da Irak'ta, ya da Mısır'da, ya da Avrupa'nın herhangi bir yerinde, ya da Yunanistan'da örneğin kötü muamele görebiliyor. Ama mülteci kötü muamele gördüğünde bunun mülteci haklarının ilhası olduğu söylenebilir. Fakat mülteci haklarını ihlal eden ülkelere yönelik bir uluslararası mekanizma, caydırıcılık oluşturan, caydırıcılık gücüne sahip olan, hukuki yollarla caydırıcılık gücüne sahip olan, ihlal edici güce, ülkeye bedel ödetebilen bir uluslararası mekanizma olmadığı için mülteciler normal koşullar altında yaşayamıyorlar. Yani Suriye'den kaçtığında biraz daha hallice, belki öldürülme olanı düşüyor. Yani öldürülme olasılığı ortadan yok oluyor ama insani olarak yaşama imkanına sahip olamıyor. Bunun da temel nedeni hem bir yönüyle uluslararası hukukun, mülteci hukukunun yeteri kadar detaylanmamış olması, net olmaması, hala yorumlara çok açık olması ve isteyen aktörün bunu kendi istediği ve çıkarları doğrusunda yorumlayabiliyor olmasından kaynaklanıyor. Ama bir taraftan da bu ihlal edildiği zaman mülteci hukuku buna yaptırım uygulayacak, ihlal eden ülkeye yaptırım veya ülkelere yaptırım uygulayacak uluslararası mekanizmaların güç sahibi, yaptırım gücüne sahip mekanizmaların olmamasından kaynaklanıyor. Bu yüzden gazeteciler sadece mülteci haberi yapmamalılar. Aynı zamanda mülteci hakları konusunda da sürekli yoğun bir biçimde haber yapmalılar. Mülteci haklarının ihlallerine yönelik de yoğun bir haber kampanyası yapmalılar. Yani mültecilik sadece Suriye'den, Irak'tan kopmuş olmak değil. Mültecilik gittiği ülkede de devam edebiliyor. Avrupa Birliği ülkesi olan Yunanistan'da da devam edebiliyor. Fransa'da da devam edebiliyor. Almanya'da da devam edebiliyor. Türkiye'de de bu devam ediyor mültecilik hali. Ve bu insanlar yaşamaya, sorunlar yaşamaya devam ediyorlar. Dolayısıyla gazetecinin bu mültecilerin karşılaştıkları sorunları sürekli dile getirmeleri lazım ama aynı zamanda yaptıkları haberlerle uluslararası toplum üzerine özellikle de güç veya hukuk oluşturabilecek devletlere, bu kapasitedeki devletler üzerinde bir baskı oluşturarak hem mülteci hakları konusunda daha detaylı, net ve yoruma daha az kapalı metinlerin oluşturulması, aynı zamanda mülteci hakları ihlal edildiğinde bunları cezalandıracak, caydırıcılık oluşturacak mekanizmaların oluşması için de yoğun bir kampanyanın içerisinde olmaları lazım. Hem toplumu hem de uluslararası camiayı bu konuda sürekli tetikte tutmaları lazım ve farkındalığı arttırmaları lazım. Dolayısıyla bu üç katman oldukça birbirinin devamı, birbiriyle ilişkili ve mutlaka yapılması gereken meseleler olarak görüyorum. Birincisi, bu kişilerin mülteci olarak adlandırıldıkları andan itibaren yabancılaştırıldıklarını görmemiz gerekiyor. İkincisi, gazetecinin mültecilere yaklaşırken ideolojik kalıplardan etnik, sekteryen ve aynı zamanda sosyal sınıf oluşturan bütün lenslerden ayrı bir biçimde bunlardan bağımsız olarak meseleye yaklaşması gerekiyor. Üçüncüsü, mülteci hakları konusunun netleşmesi ve mülteci hakları ihlal edildiği zaman yaptırım gücüne sahip olan uluslararası kurumların var olması ihtiyacı. Bu üç mesele birbiriyle yakından ilişkili, birbirinin devamı. Bu üç konuda şayet bir çözüme ulaştırılamazsa, netlik sağlanamazsa maalesef bu mülteci meselesi sürekli kendisini tekrarlayan fasit bir daire olarak hayatımızda var olacak. Bizler için bir haber unsuru olacak ama bu sorun, bu dram orada kalmaya devam edecek.
Thank you for that. I actually want to drill down on something you mentioned there about reporting with maybe preconceived ideologies about a particular group or ethnicity. Do you think that that is self-censorship or self-directed by the individual journalists and correspondents, or do you think that this is more of an ingrained problem from the top down as far as editorial policy in news organization goes? Where do you see the weight of the problem lying?
I think both. Her ikisi de. Burada hem gazetecinin kendisinin gelmiş olduğu sosyal sınıf, ideolojik background, dünya görüşü, etnik yapı, dini yapı her ne olursa olsun, hem gazetecinin kendisinin burada bir self-censorship uyguladığını, bir filtre uyguladığını maalesef görüyorum. Çünkü hem de aynı zamanda haber merkezleri, yani from top to down bir kararı olarak da bunun yapıldığını kanaatindeyim. Çünkü bu ikisi birbirinden bağımsız değil. Yani gazetecinin sadece kendisinden kaynaklanan bir problem olursa haber merkezi buna müdahale edebilir ve bunun tekrarlanmamasının önüne geçebilir. Ama hem haber merkezinin tercihi bu konuda olunca hem de gazeteci bu tercihe uygun olarak kendi kendisine bir self-censorship uyguladığında, ideolojik lenslerle meseleye baktığında ortaya bu sonuç çıkıyor. Dolayısıyla zaten biraz da mesele tamamen bu. Yani gazetelerin, haber merkezlerinin editoryal otonomiye sahip olmalarının hakikati, önemi, hayatiyeti de burada ortaya çıkıyor. Yani bu editoryal yapılar maalesef medyada, bu sadece dünyanın bu tarafında değil, aynı zamanda ben Batı'da da gazetecilerde bir ideolojikleşme eğilimi görüyorum. Yani bu mesleğin, gazetecilik mesleğin hatta ana prensiplerini oluşturan çok büyük medya kuruluşları da dahil olmak üzere bir ideolojikleşme eğilimi gösterdikleri kanaatindeyim. Hem gazetecilerin kendisi bir ideolojikleşme eğilimi gösteriyorlar. Yani çok fazla böyle opinionated o hale geliyorlar. Aktivist gibi davranmaya başlıyorlar. İdeolojik lensleri daha belirleyici oluyor ve kendilerini ideolojik olarak daha çok ortaya koymaya hevesi ortaya çıkıyor. Hem de haber merkezleri veya medya organizasyonları aşırı bir biçimde politik pozisyonlara angaje hale geliyorlar. Daha çok politikleşebiliyorlar. Bir yerlere düşman olabiliyorlar, bir yerleriyle müttefik olabiliyorlar. Bu aşırı ideolojikleşme hali hem gazetecinin kendisinde hem de kurumlarda var olan bir mesele ve o ikisi birleşince az önce bahsettiğim sorun ortaya çıkıyor.
Thank you so much, Rasul, for those thoughts. I also want to just add for our panelists, for our audience members as well, if you look along the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a section, it may be hiding under the tab called More. There's a Q&A button. If you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts that you would like the panelists to address, please feel free to write your questions into that Q&A box. And if it's appropriate at the relevant time, I will direct those questions to our panelists. Zia Eshamzada has taken advantage of this function already to pick up on something, Rasul, that you mentioned. She said, as a former refugee, she appreciates Rasul Bey's sentiments and understands his concerns when it comes to the social stigma of labeling someone as a refugee. But she does point out an interesting point, which you did also raise there, that when one is considered a refugee, there are some benefits that come to them from a host nation, rights based on UN resolutions, where they must be provided with certain support. And that's why, yeah, she says that you can't really get rid of the term refugee because it's a technical legal term. But I note that your issue in your comments there, Rasul Bey, is that it's the stigma that comes with those terms, and it's very difficult to overcome stigmas like that, and definitely something that as journalists we are always needing to be so cautious of. One thing I will always remember from studying journalism: one person's terrorist is someone else's freedom fighter. Nothing is black and white when it comes to reporting, and in a situation like this, it's even more obvious. Okay, let's turn our focus now over to Isio Enrich, who is a freelance journalist joining us from Berlin. I think we're all really interested to hear your input, Isio, because we've been hearing from Turkey-based correspondents up until now. So please take the floor and give us your points of view. We're really looking forward to hearing from them. Isio Enrich from Berlin, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Melinda. I'm happy to talk to you guys. I will not dive so much into the political dimension of reporting on migration. I want to give a little insight into what it's like to be a journalist in the field who is working on migration. I have a personal background of migration myself. My mom is German, my dad is from Nigeria. I've somewhat always been interested in people moving to other countries or topics such as asylum policies, integration, racism. I was reporting about migration well before the so-called refugee crisis occurred. But when it hit in 2015, it was for sure a development that I embraced as a chance on the professional level. On a personal level, I must admit that it has been quite a challenge as well at times. It is by no means easy to get the professional and the personal in line when it comes to reporting about migration. What I'm trying to say is it's not so much that it's hard to stay objective as possible as it is in face of distress and suffering. For me, the biggest challenge was rather to decide when to be first and foremost a journalist and when to be first and foremost a human being. Let me give you a couple of examples for that. In late 2015, I was working on a story about a place that's called Lageso. It's an institution in Berlin where migrants arrive to register as refugees. In the heights of the so-called refugee crisis, the fine-tuned German bureaucracy all of a sudden was pretty overwhelmed. People were waiting in front of this place Lageso for countless hours to finally talk to a representative of the state. It was winter, it was cold, people were shivering. One day, one of my interview partners contacted me. He sent me a message and he was basically saying, look, I'm so desperate, I'm just going to set myself on fire in front of Lageso. Obviously, there was no way to be merely an observer anymore. There was no way to be just a journalist who was working on a story. So together with a friend, I met the guy and we managed to talk him out of his plans. After all, what this person really needed was somebody who listens to him. I think this situation is an example where it is rather an easy call to make what to do. In this case, it means just forget about journalism for a moment, be a human being. But obviously there are circumstances when it's not that easy. It was also in 2015 when I accompanied a group of young men from Eritrea who were on their way from Italy to the north of Europe. For quite a while, I managed to be the so-called fly on the wall that journalists always desire to be. What I mean is that you are merely an observer. Your actions and what you do does not have an impact of the things evolving around you. But at some point, members of the group started asking me, hey, Isio, where should we go next? Which route should we take? Which train should we hop on to make it to the other side of the border and avoid the police? All of a sudden, I was in a dilemma, professionally, on the moral side, but also on a legal side. Can I still be the observer I'd like to be? What are my duties as a human being? Am I maybe even breaking the law if I guide the people on the move to the other side of the border and they manage to avoid the police? In a sense, I guess I was kind of lucky in that situation because I simply didn't know how it would be possible to cross the border without running into the police. I didn't have a call to make. Nevertheless, that was a situation that affected me quite a bit. I was just on a human side of it, I was devastated when the whole group was caught and they were still far away from their final destination, far from fulfilling their dreams that they had for such a long time. And this unpleasant feeling of responsibility for their fate remained quite a long time. At the same time, I also knew that I will find myself in similar situations time and again in the future, being a journalist working on migration. How to act? What if I knew how to make it to the other side of the border? Should I tell them? Should I remain silent? It is just a general dilemma you find yourself in as a journalist. And then there are also those situations where there's usually not really a debate about whether there is a certain action to do or not. Like your heart is telling you, you have to act, you have to help the person who's in front of you, who's in need. But in some cases, your journalistic ethics just clearly forbid it. And it can be hard, but it's absolutely necessary to stick to it. Let me give you an example. When I'm working in crisis areas, I get asked all the time if I have money to share while talking to people. When working with a translator in the field, more often than not, they ask in advance, is it possible to support the people that we will be talking to do on this given day? It's always a challenge emotionally, but in the end, the answer of a journalist always has to be no in that kind of situation. I've witnessed too many times what happens if journalists give in to the temptation of helping their interview partners with money. Very quickly, little markets develop in which people tell journalists stories that they expect the journalists would like to hear. That's definitely the death of authentic reporting. Don't get me wrong, it can be a completely different story if after a story was published and there's like a genuine relationship developing between the journalist and the protagonist of his stories. If there's a friendship developing, I mean, why wouldn't you support a friend? But in general, and I think that's always very important to bear in mind when in the field and working on human tragedy and stories about migration, it's always very important to bear in mind that you usually have to say no to people who are really in need. That's one of the challenges I just wanted to point out when it comes to reporting on migration. Apart from this personal struggle I described, there's one more general observation that I would like to share, and it kind of connects a bit to what Mr. Atesh said before. Looking back at 2015 and drawing a line till today, I see one huge deficit when it comes to reporting migration. And the problem is that the general public is usually not very interested in what happens far from home. I think in 2015, the majority of people in Europe got interested in migration merely because people were on the move and got very close to them. And the reporting was reflecting that. Media outlets were reporting about people on the move coming closer and closer to Europe. There was, from my point of view, a big gap, like authentic reporting about the home countries of the refugees was neglected all too often. And I think that's a huge problem. There were so many reports about people in extreme distress who are going through outstanding experiences in outstanding circumstances. Don't get me wrong, those stories are very vital and important, but there's so much more to know when it comes to building a better understanding of what is really happening in the world. Let me give you one more example for that. I work intensively and a lot in the Sahel area in Western Africa. It's a very good example for the fact that the general public is not really interested in complex political, economic, ecological, environmental dynamics far from home, let alone interest in stories about the ordinary life of people living in those countries. For me as a freelancer, it's always quite a big struggle to sell any story from that region in media outlets in Germany and also in other European countries. And the problem is that this lack of interest leads to a phenomenon that I would call alienation. And this once again leads to the fact that there are some very obvious things in our world that are going wrong, which are overseen by the media outlets and hence also by the wider public. I live in Berlin, and living in Berlin, it is quite striking to see how many so-called expats there are. They come from New York, they come from Melbourne, Paris, Stockholm. They basically left their home country for a better life in Germany. Everybody understands their journey, and no one would come up with the idea of calling them migrants. And I always wonder why. It is a totally different story when young women and men from Western Africa or the Middle East are coming to Europe for a better life. And I think it's really important to point out that differentiation because it is such an obvious reflection of the power dynamics in our globalized world. And globalized in that case means it is globalized for a very few people in Europe and a handful of other countries in the world. But in realities, those people who are on the moves that Mr. Artish referred to as refugees, and he described the problematic that go along with the term, those people have the same desires, the same dreams, and the same rights that we have. By ignoring that fact, we are losing the capability of solidarity, which used to be a driving factor in human development. And I mean, in those times of COVID-19, it is particularly shocking for me to witness what is happening. Out of all things, it is a global pandemic that seems to amplify this effect. Sadly, at the moment, what really seems to matter when it comes to reporting the pandemic, it's the effects of the virus on the own population only. The interest in what is happening in other countries is not very high on the agenda in most of the media outlets. And so reporting at the moment seems to me very often as it is a reflection of a more restricted worldview than ever. And that's a problem. I think for us as journalists and for media outlets, it's a huge challenge, but also an obligation to invest into more expensive, but also valuable in-depth reporting from so-called remote places or places that are not often visited. I think it is our duty to find ways to make people interested in the stories that truly matter, no matter how complex they are. And I think we as journalists really need to find ways to promote the kind of stories that lead to a better understanding of our world. And by doing so, sparking true solidarity instead of alienation, what is happening a lot at the moment. There's one more thing I would like to share with you, and it's a takeaway that is a bit more personal for me, being a person of color and working on the topic of migration. I will give you a short example and then explain what I'm trying to say. It was on New Year's Eve 2015 when there were numerous cases of theft and sexual assault on a gathering in front of Cologne's main train station. The culprits were mostly identified as refugees. The police was not prepared to prevent the attacks. An intense debate started in Germany about the failures of the authorities, the police. And then 1 year later, the police kind of reacted and they systematically checked young men who looked like they had a history of migration. It was a very obvious case of racial profiling. I was working on a story about that. And I remember a senior editor approaching me, and he asked me, hey, do you think that this racial profiling might be acceptable in this case? Shouldn't it be bearable for somebody like you to be checked by the police a little more often for the greater good? I think it's important to point out that the editor that approached me was an educated white male equipped with pretty much all the privileges one can think of in our modern world. And I think till today, this is the case for the vast majority of journalists in Germany and also in the rest of Europe. I think Turkey is not a big difference when it comes to that. And this factor is really important, I think. The narrative of the events is dominated by those in power and privilege. Being a person of color myself, I experienced that time and again. And I think there is a change needed when it comes to that. And if you really want to establish a better representation of our world in the media, we really need more diversity in the ranks of journalists, especially when it comes to reporting about migration. Summing it all up, my takeaways after reporting on migration for years now might seem rather simple, and by no means I'm the first journalist to point them out, but I think they kind of represent the core of what it's about. It's important, first of all, to report from where the roots of migration lie. It doesn't help if you only report about migration. We also shall not shy away from trying to describe complexity. Stories which picture migrants as something alien are always misleading to a high extent. We need to find stories that show migrants that they have the same desires, the same rights that we have. Stories which promote true solidarity. Finding those stories makes it necessary to question your own perspective and privileges. And finding those stories also forces you as a journalist to be aware of the power dynamics of the system that you are working and living in. So I think it's very important to make sure that you find ways to describe those dynamics as often as possible. And I think that's about it when it comes to reporting on migration.
Yeah, there are some really interesting points that you raised there. And I think it's something that you and I actually discussed on the phone together as we were preparing for this web seminar. It's that constant tension for journalists between reporting, these incredibly dramatic stories and adhering to your deadlines and focusing on, like you say, the moral dilemmas, the ethical dilemmas, getting the story done. But then also, these are very sensitive issues, and you are having to face your own sort of personal dilemmas and discrimination against yourself as you're trying to do your job. How do you feel supported, or how do you feel that journalists can balance their mental health when they are reporting on situations like this? Are there frameworks in place, or is this just something that you personally have been left to deal with as you wrap up a story and then have to evaluate how it feels?
No, I mean, of course, there are colleagues one can talk to anytime, and you need to build your group of colleagues to talk to. And I think that's very important to have that security net. And then, of course, there are friends who don't have to be journalists and family to cope with that situation. And then in many media outlets, there are people who are there to talk to as well. So you're not alone with it. But yeah, I think my point was just giving an idea of kind of the tension that you're in as a journalist when working on those stories. There are security nets, there are structures in place that can help. But I think it's important also to know for viewers and media recipients what journalists actually do, what they're going through, what they feel while they are working on a story, because that's usually what's not reported. And I think that explains to a high extent why reporting is the way it is, and where there could be a means of making reporting better in the future.
Absolutely, it definitely does go behind the lens, and it's a really interesting takeaway from today's discussion. Thank you so much, Isio, for those remarks. Perhaps now we should turn to Dr. Levent Soysal from Kadir Has University. He's also the Communication Committee member for the Turkish National Commission for UNESCO. As a respondent to our participants. Doctor, what would you, what observations do you take away from what's been discussed?
And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be a kind of a respondent, let's say. I mean, I learned a lot from the presentations, and I agree with most of them. If I look from the point of view of what is reported in the media, or from the point of view of the, like Isio has said, that from the point of view of the journalist himself or herself, reporting and the issues. I want to make a couple of comments which may be outside of what has been talked so far, but I think it has these points have relevance to the issue. Most of the stories we see in the media are driven by the word, let me say, empathy. Empathy for the refugee, empathy for the migrant. And these are mostly human tragedy stories or personal stories of migrants, trials and tribulations of migrancy or refugee status. Another majority are about like culture and identity stories. And the problem with that is it immediately collapses into us and them rhetoric. One thing which is not in the stories is the membership, the issue of membership. Once somebody comes into a society like Turkey or Germany or European Union, whatever you call, what kind of membership status that person has. Now we have lots of, including citizenship, up and including citizenship. I mean, when we talk about these migrants as members of a society, then we are talking about a right-bearing person. Yes, there might be culture and identity issues, there might be personal tragedies and other personal stories, but then we are invoking membership status, which brings me the term I myself use is incorporation, which is incorporating that person into the institutions of the society. These are inclusive, for instance, education, healthcare, labor market, all sorts of institutions. Of course, this kind of an inclusion requires a membership status. Okay, for instance, I mean, in Turkey, Syrian refugees are under a law, as they have a status, the law which gives them a certain status. And this sort of, this issue has to be brought into question. I mean, into question meaning that into the front, so that, I mean, we turn all these people, illegal, legal, whatever, however they come, into right-bearing members of the society, which ultimately, of course, citizenship. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the refugee system, as we know it today, is, I think, broken, if not overwhelmed, okay? It's overwhelmed, if not broken, actually. I should turn it around. And this system has to be questioned. I mean, there were some references to the problems with the system, but I don't think the current refugee system has the capacity to deal with these large numbers of movements of people. These are kind of like, whether you call them refugee problems, whether you call them migration problems, but nonetheless, this system is not equipped to deal with it. I mean, the latest example is that Denmark is trying to outsource the refugees, send them to Ethiopia or Rwanda during the time that they are processed in Denmark. So this is not a sustainable or tenable process. I think the correspondent for the Al Jazeera mentioned a little bit about this problem of refugee system, but I think it's larger than that. And I think we need editorials, at least, that touch upon these matters and make them institutional problems rather than personal issues or culture, matters of culture, and whether their culture is compatible with our culture, or that sort of discussion which goes nowhere, actually. I stop here. Thank you.
Dr. Levent, sorry, Sarah, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. As I mentioned, we are really happy to take questions and direct them to our panelists. If there's anything from our audience that you would like to ask, use the Q&A section that you can find along the bottom of your Zoom screen. But perhaps I will turn over to Tolga. You have touched base with us through the chat screen for a question about the ethical dilemma. So ask away.
Thank you, Melinda. First of all, I'd like to thank all the participants and the speakers to this meeting, because I have been learning a lot in the last hour. I mean, all these remarks, interesting remarks regarding the media and migration provided me a much broader perspective around the issue. I'd like to address a question regarding the ethical dilemma that Isio mentioned. Ethics is a popular and current topic we work often in UNESCO. I mean, the ethics of education, the ethics of culture, ethics of communication, and even the ethics of artificial intelligence. But when it comes to the ethics of a journalist working towards the refugees, I guess it becomes much more complex. I mean, when you're in the field, do you always switch into the civilian mode and feel the urge to try helping people? I mean, do you ask yourself the questions such as, what is my chief obligation here? Is it to report, or do I need to take a moment to do the humanitarian thing that is necessary? I mean, of course, by reporting on the refugee crisis, the journalists are helping to give migrants an identity, helping to remove the perception that crowds are an unnamed threat reaching the European shores, because each of the people in this mass migration are human beings. They each have their own individual stories and have gone through any number of traumas back home. So it's great reporting to them. So what I like to what I like to learn is that how do you overcome this dilemma? I mean, is this something that prevents you from doing your job in a professional manner, or on contrary, is it even a driving force that pushes you further into doing your job with your heart and soul? So this is, I'd like to ask, maybe to direct it to Melinda or Sarah, because I guess ECO has provided his thoughts on this in a way.
Why don't I hand it over to Sarah first of all? I was going to ask your comments on it, Sarah, because I think Istio did articulate what is a really big challenge for journalists on the ground. So why don't you give us your thoughts, and then we'll hand back to Istio for any further comments. Sarah, you are still on mute.
Thank you.
There she is. Welcome back.
Yes, Istio, I wanted to say thank you for your overview, and with your particular comment on what happened to you when you were talking about power structures with the white editor. I'm so sorry that you were in that situation. That's a horrendous situation to be put in. And one of the things that I found at TRT World, which is really important, I think, to mention when it comes to reporting on the refugee crisis and stories where I've gone into places like Syria, is that we have such a diverse newsroom, and it has made a huge difference to my ability to report these stories fairly accurately and with a much greater understanding. And I certainly wouldn't have had anywhere near the depth of understanding and access and support had we not had such a diverse newsroom. I mean, I simply wouldn't be able to do my job properly without the support of our Middle East team that you know, are a huge part. And I think that is so important to note. You know, it really has a huge impact on the end product. And diversity in newsrooms, you know, across the world is extremely poor. So I'm really proud myself to work in a diverse newsroom, and it is very important. On the issue of ethics, it is something that comes up a lot, and in particular in Syria, and when you're covering the refugee crisis, I think it's one of those situations where you throw out the old adage of, you know, the story comes first. In this instance, when you're dealing with people who are often highly traumatized, that have been through very serious hardships, you have to put the human before the story every time. And that often means that you have to take more time with the story. You have to spend more time with people. You sometimes won't get interviews or talk to people you think would make a great story if it's very clear that it would do them more harm than it would good. An example of that is when we were covering the situation of people being rescued in the boats as they were trying to cross the Aegean. I mean, it was very clear in those moments when people were being brought on board that they were highly traumatized. And it wasn't the moment to be sticking a camera or a microphone in their face. I was very lucky that, again, I was with a very experienced cameraman, a very experienced team who stayed out of the way, and we held back and just made sure that the people on board who were trained to save the lives of these people were doing their job, were getting them safely out of the boat, and that we weren't in the way. And that's just one area where, you know, you really do have to understand that in those situations, it's actually life and death. You know, your story is not, it can't be at the forefront of your mind. And on the mental health side of things as well, I think, just for journalists that are reporting on the refugee crisis, that is one big lesson that I've learned over the years, is that it's not a story where you want to rush in. You want to take your time. You don't want to cause more harm to people who are highly traumatized in many cases. And there are huge mental health implications, you know, people who are living in camps who don't have access to the services that they need and the support that they need. So, you know, yeah, that's not talked about so often, actually. It's something you kind of have to learn on your own in the field, but it really has a huge impact on the way that you approach this particular story when you're interviewing refugees and when you're covering the refugee crisis. You do, I think, you have to put the story in a back burner a bit and just be very aware that you're dealing with a human being with a very complex situation, and they have to come first, and their needs have to come first.
It does add a really difficult, like a level of complexity to the reporting. Before I throw over to you, Isio, I've got a question, which I'm going to direct to you, actually, and I'm really glad that it's been asked because it's coming from Dr. Tariq Shikawi, who is from the head of our TRT World Research Centre. And Dr. Tariq, I was going to call on you for some comments as well, so I appreciate you jumping in here. I'd like to, well, he would like to ask rather, and I'll direct this to you, Isio. In cases where reporting on migrants, it can often be sensationalized, and that does lead to fear-mongering in a lot of mainstream media. He asks, who is to blame more, the journalist, the editor, senior management, or are they all equally to blame? As a freelancer, how do you approach something like this? Do you ever get pushed to sort of try and take your reporting in one direction or another?
No, I guess as a freelancer, I'm kind of in a good spot when it comes to that, because I can choose who I work for. So the newspapers that I work for, the media outlets I work for, I chose them for a reason, because I know that, I mean, I've been on research to Mali, and it was like a difficult research, an intense research, and the story kind of evolved around one particular protagonist, which is always difficult if you are trying to report, if you are dependent on one person who is telling a story. And I was very happy that my editor, my supervisor, told me, it's no problem if you come back without a story. Try to go there, try to do as much as you can, try to find out what is really happening. And the final result was that the story that I had in mind when I was going there was a completely different one than the one that I brought home. And I think for freelancers, it's incredibly important to choose the outlets that allow you that freedom, and also outlets that give you enough time in the field to really look for the story that's there. And what happens a lot nowadays is that you kind of think about, okay, what will be the story when I get there? But you can't come up with a story that's close to reality when you're sitting at your desk in Berlin or in Istanbul or somewhere else. You have to go there and you have to spend time there. So to the question of Dr. Tarek, for me, it's hard to answer. I think everyone has his share and responsibility when it comes to sensationalist reporting. It's the journalist on the field who is delivering the material to build a sensationalist article or news piece, and then it's the editor-in-chief who should be stopping him from doing that, but he isn't, and then it's the management. I think it all goes hand in hand, so I can't really answer that question. I can just talk about freelance journalists, and for them I think it's a high priority. Choose wisely whom you're working for.
It's a tough balance. I am very mindful of the time. We are drawing close to the end here. We've only got a few minutes left, but Dr. Tarek has another question that he'd like to direct to you, Sarah. How do you deal with the issue of objectification of refugees? You know, you're using them to get a good story. How do you make sure that, yeah, as journalists, we're not objectifying or glorifying their drama and their trauma? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. Again, I think that the sort of having an ethical approach, you know, making sure that the people that you're reporting on, that you're interviewing, are fully aware of what the story is going to be, that they're given the space and the time to tell their own story in their own words. You know, when it comes to reporting on Syrian refugees who've fled the country, I mean, often it's very real, because there's a threat to not just their lives, but the lives of their family members who are still many times in the country and under threat. So, you know, you've got to be extremely careful and aware of all of that when you're reporting. I mean, there is obviously there are obviously moments where I think what I find difficult in what I find hardest in reporting these stories is the sort of parachuting element of it. You know, even when I've worked on a story like Syria for many, many years now, inside the country and in refugee camps, and have got to know, you know, the sort of full context of the Syrian refugee crisis, from, you know, its causes and what's happening on the ground to the challenges that are faced over many years by the refugees. It's the fact that you can always sort of opt out. You know, you get your story, you wrap up, you've got your images, and then you're gone. And I suppose I sort of balance that again by making sure that the people that we're interviewing, you've got to be very honest about the fact that, you know, in many cases, this isn't going to be some sort of magic story that's going to make their situation better. But often you find, or I've found with a lot of people, that being listened to, having the opportunity to tell their story can be quite cathartic for them. But also then there's a responsibility as a journalist to stay with the story. You know, when we're talking about how a story can potentially be twisted, or I mean, there's just no way that I would be able to sit by and watch a story that I had produced and been on the ground and done interviews with people go out or be misrepresented without saying something, because again, you know, that's an ethical question. What you've, you know, sat down and looked someone in the eye and told them you're doing, if that's then not what's being delivered or being misrepresented, that's not acceptable as a journalist. But yes, the sort of objectification, just, you know, I think it's just really important to bear in mind the responsibility that you have in telling these stories. And it is increased when it comes to telling stories of refugees, because as I said, you're often dropping in on these people at one of the most horrendous moments in their lives, when they've suffered a huge amount of trauma. So just all the responsibilities, all the questions yourself on a normal story as a reporter, you know, it's all heightened. It's more important, I think.
We are going to go over time, but I just want to throw one more question to you, Sarah, before we wrap up, from Mr. Murat Erdogan, who is from the Turkish-German University's Migration and Integration Research Center, but also a communication committee member with the Turkish National Commission for UNESCO. He asks, how do you deal with the, with regards to Frontex, and so I direct this to you, Sarah, seeing as you have had experience with them. What is the difference between Frontex pushback actions that you've been seeing and the EU's extra nationalism policy? Is it that they're going hand in hand?
Yes, I think it is. And I think the difficulty with the refugee crisis, you know, since 2015, there have been moments in the public perception, and what comes to mind is the death of Aylan Kurdi, where you have these sort of moments of reckoning with the public, where there is an outpouring of sympathy, and where the coverage is such, where the story is such that it really strikes a chord. But unfortunately, what we've seen in a lot of EU countries in particular is this sort of shift to the right. And, you know, I'm being British myself, we've had Brexit, and I've watched over the years the narrative significantly turn when it comes to refugees and almost be used. And you can see that happening to some extent as well in Greece right now, where the anti-refugee rhetoric is being used to gain public support by the politicians. And that's dangerous, because in those instances, then you're essentially, if the narrative and the media and the reporting around the refugee crisis is such that it's so negative, that you have a population that is anti-refugees, it then is in the politicians' interest to have an anti-refugee rhetoric. And you see actions like the pushbacks that are carried out, not really gaining much traction with the public. I mean, the question for me has always been, I remember this right at the beginning of the Syrian conflict, when refugees, I was reporting in Lebanon in refugee camps, and Britain at the time was making big promises about what they were going to do to support refugees. And as I said, over the years, you know, have fallen drastically short. It's not just Britain. You know, one of our other speakers, Denmark, is now talking about sending Syrian refugees to Damascus, saying Damascus is safe, which is, you know, a gross oversimplification of the situation on the ground there. Deeply disturbing. And yet those actions, you know, Frontex, the EU border force being involved in pushbacks, people at sea who need rescuing, threatening to send Syrians back to the country where there is still the threat and control there. The anti-refugee rhetoric in Britain, and we are woefully short of its commitments to the organisations like that is dangerous, because it means there is a lack of accountability. Need the public to be on side with this, and that more than ever, it's so important as journalists that we really make sure that we're staying across these stories and getting the sort of human narrative out there, so that people can understand a bit more about what, you know, what people.
Just one.
Thank you. Oh, yes,
just one short remark. Reading the question from Professor Erdogan, I think it's totally a valid and interesting one. What's the difference between Frontex pushbacks actions and EU externalization policy? I think one thing that also has to be asked, just to get like a wider perspective, that should not be forgiven, because we've been talking about the European Union and Frontex and pushbacks. I think what would be part of that question as well, or could be, is what does it mean building a war in that context to the border of Syria and making it impossible for Syrians to enter Turkey to an extent? I think just for getting the full picture, it's important to raise that question as well.
It is a topic that we could talk about all afternoon, and I think everyone has raised some really interesting points that I think we're all going to take away with us and really ponder over. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm very sorry if we haven't gotten to some of those questions that were asked in our Q&A section. I apologize that we have run out of time for those, but I do hope that you have really been able to broaden our minds and understandings with regards to media reporting and migration. We would certainly like to thank the Turkish National Commission for UNESCO for bringing us all together today, in particular, Professor Dr. Deniz Bayraktar, and for her opening comments, and also to Dr. Levent Soysal for the response. A special thank you, of course, to our participants, Resul Serdar Atash, Sarah Firth, and Isio Enric. Thank you so much for your insight, for your thoughts, and also for what I think everyone will really appreciate is sharing some really personal experiences that you have all had. We all read the stories about migration. We follow the issues across the media, but hearing the personal experiences from you and what you experience as you're covering them and what you've experienced personally as reporters, I think is eye-opening and important for the audience to understand as well. So thank you for your contribution. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Please stay safe, keep your minds broad when we're absorbing the media, and we really do appreciate your time and your attention. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. My pleasure. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.